Hello and welcome to the Medieval Times podcast. My name is Brian Liberatore and I will be your host this evening. Today we are talking about the Crusades, and more specifically we are going to analyze how they are represented in today's world. But first we have to have a brief overview of the Crusades and how they started. On November 27th, 1095, Pope Urban II gave a sermon at the Council of Clermont that ignited the Crusade era. In this speech, he spoke of atrocities that were going on in the homeland of Jerusalem. Along with this, he promised absolution for the Crusaders. This made the crusade very tempting for some Christians. Pope Urban had other intentions, though, by calling for this crusade. He wanted to help the Byzantines in order to secure more legitimacy for his papacy, because there was a second pope in the Vatican at this time, and Pope Urban was based in France. Different princes, kings, knights, and lords all participated in the various crusades, coming from France, Italy, England, and Eastern Europe. The first crusaders stopped on their long trek to Jerusalem and Antioch and eventually became besieged in the city by a powerful Muslim ruler, Kerboga of Mosul. According to accounts, all hope was lost until a French peasant named Peter of Bartholomew claimed to have been shown the resting place of the Holy Lance by St. Andrew. This was the lance that was said to have stabbed the side of Christ while he was on the cross. Peter took a group of people to St. Peter's Basilica in Antioch and started to dig for the lance, until finally he pulled a lance from the ground, which was probably just in fact a metal shard. However, this reignited morale and really energized the Crusaders' state of mind. It was as if they had divine support. After this, they went on to win the siege of Antioch. This made the Crusaders even more confident in their divine support, since they had defeated what seemed like an undefeatable army. However, infighting in Kerboga's army is what made this possible. This is an area where there is some debate on how this event is portrayed, because according to a local historian, the Crusaders were famished and were going to swear to go home as long as they could have their lives. But history remembers these men as unwavering Christian zealots, when in actuality they were ready to pack up and leave. After Antioch, European lordling Bohemond decided to stay and rule the city, and Raymond of Toulouse, the wielder of the Holy Lance, wanted further conquest in Lebanon and Syria. The Crusaders were pretty upset with the holdups until finally Godfrey of Bouillon took control and took the Crusaders to Jerusalem within 3 weeks of his command. 90% of the European Crusaders were lost along the way of the 3-year journey. The Crusaders believed that if they took the city, then it would become part of the heavenly Jerusalem and be a Christian paradise. And once they broke through the walls, the Crusaders began to barbarically slaughter everyone in the city without discrimination. According to reports, there were piles of heads, hands, and feet, and blood along their ankles as they walked through the city. The Crusaders legitimately believed that killing for Christ was an expression of devotion that would open up the gates of heaven. On the 15th of July, 1099, after a 6-week siege, the Crusaders took the city, and this just further went to prove their narrative that God willed this, or Deus vult. This all reminded me about how Dennis Grow in our readings talked about the idea of Jerusalem as a Christian city and how this was popular among the clergy, the lay people, and the emperor at Constantinople in the 6th and 7th centuries. And this idea obviously carried forward all the way up to the time of the Crusades. So after the Crusaders took the city, they established some Crusader states and also controlled Jerusalem. And there was really no response from Islam because the Muslim world was disconnected at this time, and they were paralyzed by different struggles between different factions. And there was a very little idea of who the Crusaders were and why they were coming to the Middle East. So the next crusade we are going to talk about is the Third Crusade. The Second Crusade was a pretty big failure, so we're not going to talk about it. So the Third Crusade was pretty much a war between Richard the Lionheart of England and Saladin, the first Sultan of Egypt. Once Saladin took power, he conquered more and more territory in the Middle East. He eventually took Jerusalem in 1187, but didn't make it a massacre like the last time it was captured. Once the Europeans heard about this, Pope Gregory VIII called for another crusade. Richard the Lionheart answered the call and decided to gather his forces to invade the Middle East. He captured Acre and Jaffa, but failed to take Jerusalem, and he ended his crusade in a treaty and that left the control of Jerusalem to Muslim rule, but Christian pilgrimages would be allowed as long as they were unarmed. Another factor that started the crusade is when Seljuk Turks took over Jerusalem and made Christian pilgrimages impossible. It's ironic that Richard the Lionheart was revered for being a chivalrous knight in his day and in works of literature. However, he is said to have brutally massacred 3,000 unarmed Muslim soldiers, while Saladin didn't massacre the Christians in Jerusalem when he took it, but Muslims were still being known for their atrocities back in Europe during this time. After doing the research for this podcast, I realized that the Crusaders sound a lot like terrorists, or at least how media portrays terrorists, as radical religious zealots that indiscriminately murder. So often, the Crusaders wouldn't even reach their destination and would just loot and pillage Christian towns. This makes it seem like they were more hungry for blood than fulfilling the will of God. I also noticed that a lot of the sources and documentaries on the Crusades and Crusaders acknowledges how radical they were, but then they say something like, you have to understand that they truly believed what they were doing was right, and it's pretty funny because you could say the same for so many other awful groups in history. So it's kind of sad that we don't have a more negative opinion on the Crusades and the participants, but then again, it's been about 900 years, so you also don't want to hold grudges. So I wonder if in 1,000 years, historians will look back and say, well, you have to understand ISIS truly believed what they were doing was right. Probably not, and it's most likely has to do with the Crusaders being Christian and society's Eurocentric view. Saladin and Richard the Lionheart were both praised by their people as heroes during and after their death. However, now we know they both had their more savage sides to them. But still, movies today depict Richard the Lionheart as a brave, strong man, even if they do include some of his more questionable acts. A lot of movies also show the main Crusader characters as having epiphanies or having an existential crisis, which would never happen in the 1200s. Overall, it's safe to say that society views the Crusades as just an event that happened and not an atrocity of massacres committed by Christians or vice versa. Like I said earlier, this probably also has to do with the time gap between the Crusades and now. Thank you for joining me, and that will conclude our podcast.